The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild is a game that is considered to be a masterpiece, if not one of the best Zelda games ever made. But where others see mastery, I see something much different. Breath of the Wild was a huge change of form for Zelda, to the point to where many aspects that what made Zelda such a beloved game have seemed to either take a backseat or completely disappeared in this new title. Breath of the Wild is more than just a game that redefined Zelda, but it was also an experience that broke that very same franchise. So with all that laid out, sit back and relax, because today I'm going to be telling you how Breath of the Wild was the game that broke Zelda. The Legend of Zelda as a series has spanned across several generations of gamers, starting all the way back on the NES, with the original Legend of Zelda. This one title defined the basics for what Zelda was: exploration, dungeon crawling, combat, puzzle solving, and storytelling. These factors would be the blueprints for years to come, from 2D to 3D, from handheld to mainline console. Looking at any Zelda game before BOTW, you can see these factors come into play in every single time. As we advance to newer and newer titles, these elements were refined and perfected, and what made a Zelda game became that much more obvious. Exploration. Every Zelda game has to explore the world, which will lead you to many side quests and caves, gaining rewards like rubies and heart pieces. Depending on the game, the world can seem extremely vast or more self-contained, but there are still plenty of opportunities to smell the roses. And as you stop to smell those metaphorical roses, these side quests that you might encounter, or even caves and dungeons, you'll eventually find that you're missing a key item, or maybe you're not even strong enough to take on a certain challenge yet, which will force you to come back at a later time after you require the specific item or skill needed to proceed. But this backtracking leads to the next major point: self-empowerment. You start every adventure not as a hero, but as just some guy who ends up on some kind of mission, who gets thrown into the thick of it with no prior experience. Because of this, you start off weak and relatively helpless, but over time you gain more power and skills, going from just some random dude with blonde hair, or sometimes even pink hair, to a full-fledged hero as you fight off against hordes of enemies or face down the Demon King himself. At the end of every Zelda, you'll have an entire arsenal in your name, and maybe even new sword skills to put enemies in their place, to even gaining one of the best weapons in all of gaming, the Sword of Evil's Bane, the Master Sword. But this wouldn't really have the same impact without another very special element: storytelling. Zelda is an expert in storytelling. Each title has had a compelling tale to tell: stopping the Gerudo King from taking over Hyrule, saving the Twilight from an oppressive ruler, save your sister from the King of Thieves, save Termina from utter annihilation. Every Zelda is impeccably written, and they all expand on the mythos of the Legend of Zelda. These stories are all engaging, with an amazing lead up to each confrontation. Learning about the world through flavor text is always a treat, and each character just bursts with personality. Alongside this, the game's linearity helps the stories, as there is no chase of confusion or missed moments, so the impact of each event lands. But that's not the only event that has a lot of impact in Zelda. Dungeons and puzzles are another staple of Zelda that always leave a massive impact. Zelda games are renowned for their interactive puzzles and challenging dungeons. These puzzles often require creative thinking, problem solving, and effective use of various tools and items Link acquires during his journey. Dungeons offer a chance to test your skill and fight your way through a labyrinth, which almost always pays off with a boss fight that tests your skills that you've attained in that dungeon. Each dungeon is unique in its own way, and sometimes the dungeons can have an impact on the world, like Death Mountain does when you're in a dull Ocarina of Time, or the Poison Swamps from Majora's Mask. When you clear these dungeons, you can see the impact to the world, as the land clears up and you restore more of Hyrule back to the way it was. And those are just 4 of the major elements. There are still plenty of other things that make Zelda what it is today, like the characters. Link, Zelda, and Ganon are staples of the franchise. There's also the Triforce and the Master Sword, which are MacGuffins in the series that have always played huge important roles, which have led to really cool stories, like Lorule and Link Between Worlds having their own version of the Triforce. And that's still not even mentioning the music, which always sets the tone perfectly in every game. These are the elements that make Zelda what it is. But now that we step back into the past, let's step forward into the future and see how these elements are applied in Breath of the Wild. Let me start off by saying this: Breath of the Wild was genre defining, and it was one of the biggest titles to release on the Nintendo Switch. Not only that, this title redefined all of Zelda and created an entire new wave of Zelda fans. So what exactly made it so beloved? Well, let's look into it. Breath of the Wild's world is just beautiful. It's vast, lush, and open. Towns have so much personality, and you're able to walk on almost any perch and point and say, I want to go there, and go straight to that location. That vastness created a world that truly felt alive and massive when compared to all the previous titles. And it truly gave a whole new meaning to the word exploration as far as Zelda was concerned. Following that exploration came the physics engine that they created for this game, being some of the most open-ended physics I have ever seen. You can do so much in Breath of the Wild, from pushing boulders to crush enemies, to dropping bombs to blow them up, to using your runes to really break the game in many ways, like stasis for extreme travel speeds. The physics were so flexible in comparison to all the previous titles, it really felt like the world was nothing more than an open sandbox for you to just do whatever you wanted. But that's not the only thing that got an extensive overhaul. Combat as well is massively improved in this title than others, with the brand new Flurry Rush added to create a more cinematic combat system. Each fight feels extremely engaging, and taking on multiple enemies at once can feel really enjoyable. But you don't actually have to fight them in the traditional sense, as you can also slow down time with your bows, or use your champion's abilities, which you'll gain throughout your adventure, to truly eradicate enemies in many different ways. But the combat system isn't just cinematic and engaging, it's also extremely clever, and this can be seen in the weapon system. Unlike all the previous Zelda games where the items you gained stayed with you, like boomerangs or slingshots and bows, this time there's a new weapon durability system, and pretty much everything from a stick to a spoon can be a weapon. However, using these weapons will eventually break, but this is what makes the system so clever. The weapon system is consistently cycling and breathing. You're meant to use weapons that you find and pick up to take on an enemy, to grab that weapon and then use on the next foe. Eventually you'll gain higher powered weapons, which you are meant to reserve for higher level enemies that you deem as a higher threat, and normally these higher level enemies have higher level drops. So when you use your better equipment and defeat a stronger foe, normally you get a stronger piece of equipment back in return. You'll be consistently cycling through weapons all the time, where taking one enemy will lead to a new weapon, and using that weapon on another foe will lead you to another weapon. You'll never be at a time in the game where you're completely out of weapons, and that's what makes it so clever. It makes it to where you're always experiencing new types of combat and all the new weapon types in the game, while still being engaging and cinematic. But with that, there's a bit of a loss of self-empowerment, as you're always going to have weapons that will always get the job done no matter what. The runes are another big aspect of this game, which take the place of your standard items in Zelda. You'll get the runes immediately, which opens up the entire game after the Great Plateau. These runes boil down to magnesis, allowing you to pick up metal objects and moving them around in many different ways, to stasis, being able to freeze enemies or objects and use the inertia of your hits to change their direction and send them flying, to having an infinite supply of bombs, both round and square, and finally having cryonesis, which can create platforms on water, which is probably the most situational out of the bunch. The runes are lots of fun to use, and they have plenty of amazing puzzles accompanying them that will allow you to solve these puzzles in many different ways. However, this does break another big aspect of Zelda, as having these awesome runes might be dope, it definitely loses that sense of self-empowerment as you have them right at the very start. But the feeling of self-empowerment is still there, just in a more minor sense. And that's where the Great Plateau comes into play. The Great Plateau is one of the best open tutorial sections of games ever. Not only does it open up to the world to show you how vast Hyrule has now become in this new title, it also teaches you all the elements and physics that you'll need to know for your adventure. As you start on the Great Plateau, you'll get put in your place pretty damn quick. But as you explore and get these items, you get that much more powerful. And by the time you finally leave the Great Plateau, you have a great grasp on all the mechanics of the game, from all the rooms. But once you finally do leave the Great Plateau, that sense of self-empowerment does slowly diminish as you inevitably get more and more powerful through your exploration, to the point to where all the actual events in the game might actually end up becoming extremely easy. As you explore, you'll find out about 4 divine beasts, which act as the 4 major dungeons. Once you complete each of these divine beasts, you actually gain the champion abilities. The champion abilities, though kind of basic, are extremely versatile and very, very helpful. There's Revali's Gale that sends you upwards. There's Mifia's Grace if you die and it acts like a full-blown fairy. There's Daruk's Protection, which acts like a shield so you can avoid damage 3 times over. And then there's Urbosa's Fury, which acts like a freaking screen nuke that wipes everything out. Once you get these abilities, you will definitely feel like you have a more versatile arsenal, and you will feel self-empowered. All it is more of a different take on the whole motif of self-empowerment, and a character starting off as weak but getting stronger and stronger. But in this game, you already have a really good arsenal, and if you explore, you're already having good weapons and armor. These abilities just add more to an arsenal that you already have, making you that more versatile. And as far as the champions go that these abilities belong to, All these characters are beautifully written, but none of them compare to the absolute character glow up that is Zelda, but we'll get to that in a minute. There's Daruk, who pretty much thinks of Link as a brother. There's Urbosa, who's more of the mother figure to Zelda. There's Rivali, who's pretty much jealous of Link and just a constant dick, and he never actually has a moment of redemption. And then there's Mifia, who literally was in love with Link, and that was going to propose to him with the Zora armor set, but she sadly died before she got the chance to tell Link how she felt. The champions are very enjoyable and honestly tragic. The only downside to them is that in the vanilla game, without the DLC, they kind of get sidelined and they don't really get that much time to shine. But if you do have the DLC, these characters have tons of time in the spotlight, and they sure as hell deserve it. Not to mention their ancestors like Riju, Teba, Unibo, and Sidon are all great characters that are all beautifully written with bursting personalities. And to add more icing to this cake is the lead up to these dungeons. One of them is a sneaking section, another one is actually riding on the back of Sidon, my fish daddy. I mean, what? Where you have to protect yourself using cryonesis by breaking the ice blocks and shooting the 4 cores, to riding on sand seals with Riju in order to get to Naboris, to even flying in the great sky along with Teba to take on Va Mado. The build up to these dungeons is always fantastic, and it's always a treat to go back and re-experience them on repeat playthroughs. These very cinematic elements also are accompanied by great orchestral and ambient music, which always set the tone every single time. There are several memorable tracks throughout this game, and probably one of the best is definitely Hyrule Castle, which truly sets that final area tone better than most. The story is also another major element of Breath of the Wild that is pretty different from other titles, as in this story, it's more of a what-if scenario if Zelda lost, and you weren't actually able to stop Ganon the first time round. We find out about a calamity that happened 10,000 years ago that was stopped with the help of the Divine Beasts and the Guardians. The calamity does eventually come back, and preparations are began to stop this new calamity. However, Ganon's actually prepared this time, and everything falls apart, and Zelda is actually not able to awaken her true inner power, leading to the eventual defeat of not all the champions, but leading to Link's very own defeat, as Zelda's normally the one to provide that last bit of power to finally put the hurt on Ganon, normally in the shape of light arrows, but sometimes just by using light magic in general. Because of this, it creates a new dynamic, where we see a world after the events of the calamity, where everyone is dead and the world is lost, where the calamity is just on the brink of taking over all of Hyrule, and Zelda's using the last of her power to keep it at bay. Zelda as well gets a huge character glow up in this game, as in like being just a damsel in distress or a character with at least some kind of depth, Zelda is nothing but character in this game. And you learn through the memories her true struggles that she goes through as she tries to awaken her inner power, and the true regret she feels when she's actually incapable of awakening that power and saving everyone's lives. And damn, this story will make you feel a lot of emotions, at least when you're specifically focusing on the memories. Seeing Zelda cry is honestly hard to watch, especially when you watch the entirety of the story and how hard you've seen her try, to the epic moments of when you finally pull the Master Sword out of its pedestal and finally reclaim your former glory as the knight who wields the Blade of Evil's Bane, to one of the best moments in all of Zelda, landing that final line arrow right dead center in Ganon's motherfucking face. Holy crap, it is just amazing. And of course, who could forget the amazing surprise boss fight where you had to save the corrupted dragon Nadra from the malice that was infecting them. One of the coolest moments in the entire game. Not to mention that this game has one of the best moments in all of Zelda in my opinion, that being the introduction of Monk Maz from the DLC, who, my god, just listen to this. That's fucking dope! Breath of the Wild has so many of these grand, epic moments, and with the orchestra in the background, it lands every damn time. And though sometimes the soundtrack might not be all that memorable in some cases, my golly if it does not fit the tone and always complement these grand cinematics every time it comes into play. Though the story is definitely a departure from previous Zeldas, it will have you feeling some major stuff. And say what you will about the final boss, and trust me, we'll get to that, by the end of your adventure, you'll be ready to put the hurt on Ganon and finally free Zelda from what she's been dealing with this entire time and put Hyrule back to the way it was before. It's clear that Breath of the Wild did a lot of amazing things, and though some of these elements do break the original conventions of Zelda, they kind of did it for the betterment of it. Though sure I do miss the original sense of self-empowerment that Zelda provided, Breath of the Wild showed that this new cycling and breathing weapon system, engaging combat, and the memories could all provide a very well-made experience. There are still aspects that this game could have improved on, and the sequel tells that more than anything. No Zelda game is perfect. No matter how hard you try to ignore it, there will always be issues with any title. Even games that I consider to be perfect, like Twilight Princess and Minish Cap, have their own innate flaws. And even if Breath of the Wild is an enjoyable experience, there are still things that it could have improved on. In contrast to the praise that I gave the game for having such a beautiful, vast world, it sadly is a world that is fairly empty and is mostly nothing but eye candy. The game does have a variety of things to do. You have shrines, towers, Koroks, divine beasts, enemy combatants, but that's about it. Those 5 major things are all that Breath of the Wild really has to offer, and the problem with that is that you'll end up completing the divine beasts and the towers relatively quickly, which only will leave the shrines, Koroks, and enemy encounters. The enemy encounters will inevitably become stale, as the enemy variety is pretty lacking, and there are only a handful of enemies that you'll actually end up taking on, and a lot of them are just color swaps with other enemies. Now, there are overworld bosses that do make up for this aspect. You have Lionels, Hinoxes, and Stone Taluses, and Moldugas, which all provide a great unique challenge, and having a cool overworld mini-boss is always a nice little treat. There are a whole bunch of these guys all throughout the world that usually provide a pretty nice reward when you finally take them out, and or provide really rare materials. There's also the one-shot boss of Master Koga, who's one of the best boss fights in the entire game. But both Master Koga and these new overworld bosses are still pretty simple to take out. And again, minus color swapping, the variety of these mini-bosses on the overworld aren't all that much. This will make the shrines and the Koroks become the main thing that you end up doing in Breath of the Wild, and with the world being so vast and empty, there's nothing quite to really do in between the shrines and the Koroks. Finding old ruins and things of that nature also don't provide that much. Maybe you might be able to fight a few enemies, but you get to a point to where you're so high leveled, there's not actually a point in exploring these areas, and exploring ends up just becoming busy work with no actual payoff. The Koroks in and of themselves are pretty cool at the start, but inevitably become nothing but busy work and pointless towards late game, as you get to a point where it costs an astronomical amount of Korok seeds to actually expand your inventory, and finding the Koroks becomes just absolutely monotonous, as it boils down to picking up a rock or shooting a balloon to unlock only a single Korok seed. That's not even including the fact that the 100% reward for actually getting all 900 Korok seeds is a literal golden piece of shit. And that just leaves the shrines, which are truly the biggest thing in Breath of the Wild. The shrines act like small, contained puzzles and dungeons. Sometimes the puzzle is actually trying to figure out how to unlock the shrine, where you'll be granted a blessing where you get an item from it, and other times you'll be going up against an enemy like in a test of strength, and or you'll be going to a shrine that has its own puzzle inside of it. No matter what type of shrine it is, it'll inevitably gain you what's called a spirit orb, and this is how you gain extra hearts. Instead of giving you just heart pieces, you gain 4 spirit orbs and trade them in for a heart piece or a stamina wheel. Instead of just cutting out the middleman and allowing you to select either a heart piece or a stamina piece, it just adds an extra level of busy work where now you have to go to a town to find a goddess statue to then trade in the spirit orbs to get a full heart piece or a full stamina wheel. And then there's 100%ing all the shrines. There's 120 of them throughout the entirety of the game. But once you get all of them, your final reward is the Tunic of the Wild. One of the worst, most useless final upgrades you can ever get. By the time you get 120 shrines, it's already late game, which means you already have all of the best armor you could possibly have. And trying to upgrade the Tunic of the Wild takes a lot of very rare parts and a whole lot of time. So it ends up being a really cool Easter egg for sure, but there's still lots of better armor choices that you can have in the game, which kind of makes the full reward for getting all the shrines feel kind of pointless. Now, it should be noted that most of the shrines are very well designed. Most of them will have you thinking out of the box and have multiple ways to solve them, with only a handful of them not being all that memorable or being extremely short. But as a whole, the shrines are great. But when you constantly do them back to back, since they're one of the biggest points of Breath of the Wild, well, it ends up feeling kind of like busy work and a bit grindy, as you're having to do shrine after shrine, and there's nothing really else there to break that up. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the side quests. Breath of the Wild has more side quests than any other Zelda game. In early to mid-game, side quests can be a pretty fun distraction. Normally, as rewards, you can get meals, maybe certain supplies, and rubies. However, it comes to a point where the ruby count and the actual payout for doing all these quests don't really mean all that much, and you actually can get more rubies or more items by just farming them or by selling high-level materials. Now, there are of course exceptions to this rule. There are several quests that actually do give you clothing. For example, Lionel Safari actually gives you the Zora Greaves. But I'm more talking about the side quests as a whole, not specific ones. As a whole, side quests aren't all that memorable, aside from a few outliers like the Terrytown quests, and the grand majority of side quests don't really give you all that good of payouts. And that brings up a very interesting problem: grinding. Breath of the Wild has lots and lots of grinding. Whether you're grinding for rubies, materials, weapons, you'll be grinding a lot and for hours. And this also means you'll end up grinding for Korok seeds and shrines. Grinding inherently isn't a bad thing by any means, but it gets to a point to where it's just monotonous to find and get a lot of material just to upgrade your armor sets. In fact, on my personal run of this game, I ended up using glitches to mitigate this issue, and I ended up having a lot more fun, because I wanted to spend time actually experiencing the game itself, not 10 to 15 hours upgrading my gear and farming consistently just so I had a better chance against enemies. Now, I'm not saying grinding shouldn't be in the game at all, but more that it should be a little more streamlined. Maybe the cost of upgrading gear should be less. Maybe finding certain items should be more plentiful. Maybe ruby payouts should be higher. That way there's less grind and there's more time enjoying the game and exploration. And that's all that Breath of the Wild actually has to offer as far as its open world goes. The real issue isn't actually the variety itself, more of the size of the world and the variety that's available. If the world was more condensed, the world would feel jam-packed with things to do, but because the world is so massive, things feel extremely spread out between each other, which leaves lots of dead time in between objectives. And this is only the tip of the iceberg. Another issue is the story doesn't truly reflect onto the world. This is supposed to be a post-apocalyptic look at Hyrule, a look at what happened if Zelda lost. The Divine Beasts are causing havoc at all four of the major towns, and there is malice throughout the world, but it doesn't truly feel like there's anything truly wrong. The only area that is in distress is Hyrule Castle itself. Because of this, when you do go and defeat Divine Beasts and bring them back to being good, nothing really changes with the world around it. And the Divine Beasts don't really make up for this either. The Divine Beasts are meant to be the dungeons. The leads up to these are fantastic and always engaging, but once you actually enter the beasts themselves, they're pretty bland and all one note. Each of them boil down to unlocking a set amount of terminals, and you're constantly handheld throughout the entire thing. Once you finally unlock one of the terminals, a character will tell you only 3 more to go. Once you activate that one, it'll say only 2 more to go. Now, the Divine Beasts do have a cool aspect to them where you actually can change something about them, but this doesn't make up for the fact that the Divine Beasts are extremely short. On my first playthrough with this game going blind, I was able to beat it in about 30 minutes, and on repeat playthroughs, I can get in about 20 or less. Though it's really cool to have the Divine Beasts as open as they are, where you can take on the terminals in any way you want, it makes the dungeons feel less like dungeons and more like a larger shrine, and I as the player don't really end up getting the same kind of self-fulfillment as I do from completing other dungeons. Where in other Zelda games I feel like I've completed a massive labyrinth and have taken on a massive challenge, now I feel like I just did a shrine that lasted longer than most. Dungeons are one of the biggest aspects of Zelda, and Breath of the Wild doesn't quite land that mark. The Divine Beasts aren't bad by any means, they're very well designed and very well thought out. The problem is that they're not long enough, and this crescendo of constantly falling short comes to a head when you finally get to the boss of all the Divine Beasts. Each boss is literally just Calamity Ganon again, this time in the name of Blights. The Lightning Blight out of all 4 is probably the toughest out of the bunch, but each of them aren't really all that challenging, and if you actually do end up exploring the world as the game encourages you to do so, you'll be so extremely overpowered you'll end up wiping the floor with all of them. In an open world game like this, it's best for bosses to actually scale alongside the player, so no matter where you are in the game, there will still be a challenge to be had. That way, if you do go explore, you don't accidentally shoot yourself in the foot by ruining the boss of a certain dungeon because you end up wiping the floor with him in less than 10 seconds because of how overpowered you are. At Breath of the Wild, that isn't actually done. There is difficulty if you go to the Divine Beasts early, but if you explore, the Divine Beasts are nothing more than just a short shrine with a bit of a boss fight at the end, which is nowhere near as hard as some of the other bosses like Lionel's, who do scale up with the character throughout the game. Again, Divine Beasts aren't bad, it's just that there is still room for improvement with the Divine Beasts and the bosses, and those improvements are shown in the sequel, Tears of the Kingdom. Proceeding onward, another element that I do have to give a bit of critiquing to is again the story. Though I gave it praise of being an extremely different take on Zelda, the game does actually lose a lot of that mystery right at the very start. Link wakes up after being in slumber for 100 years, and you have no idea what happens. You see Hyrule in complete distress, and an open world with next to nothing in it. What happened to civilization? What happened to these people? Well, you're immediately told that by the King of Hyrule, not even 20 seconds later. Now, there's nothing wrong with this, but it seems extremely redundant, as you're encouraged to find these memories which do tell the greater story, and give more of an in-depth look at Zelda, her character, and all that happened all those years ago. Instead of having the memories be the main point of the actual story, instead they gave it an entire summary and lost all of that mystery at the very start. To make things even worse, we actually get a recap of that story 2 other times, from Pura and Impa. Zelda games traditionally don't immediately tell the full story right at the start, and if there is a mystery to be had, they don't ruin it right off the bat. It'd be the same thing if we started Wind Waker and we saw our sister get kidnapped and then immediately get told right at the very start that Ganondorf is stealing all these children in order to find Princess Zelda. Now, Breath of the Wild does have quite a few minor, more annoying issues. For example, the climbing and stamina system. And with having a world as vast and as open as it is, you never have enough stamina to truly get where you need to go. And because of this, most players end up using a glitch where you hold down the whistle button and tap the run button to effectively create infinite stamina. But that means, again, I'm having to use a glitch to mitigate an issue that's in the game. The easiest way to fix this would be to make the stamina wheel drain a whole lot slower so you could run a whole lot farther. And or don't have stamina at all when you're running and only have stamina when using special abilities like your weapons and or when you're climbing. And speaking of climbing especially is pretty rough, as Link is extremely slow when doing so, and 9 times out of 10 you're not actually going to have enough stamina to climb most areas. Not unless you make lots of elixirs and or get your stamina wheel upgraded pretty quick. And don't even get me started on how irritating it can be when you're climbing and it starts to rain, and then you start losing your grip and lose the entire ability to even climb. Now, there are ways to mitigate this, specifically with the clothing system, where clothing can give you special effects and attributes. There's actually climbing gear which helps Link climb faster, which helps with the issue for it taking a long time for Link to actually climb. But the issue is swapping between clothing is pretty bothersome, as you have to pause, go to your inventory, select the armor set you want, use it, then re-swap to another set that you actually need to use for defense. Then if you're in an area where you need to swim, you need to swap to the Zora gear, and this happens continuously throughout the game. This issue could have been easily fixed by having a hot swap system where you could favorite your favorite outfits and easily swap to them in the flick of a button. But even if the clothing system is kind of cumbersome, the clothing itself does provide an incentive for exploration and reward for that exploration. Sometimes you can get clothing through side quests, or maybe you can find them in chests. Continuing on, Breath of the Wild does also have a pretty unique issue, and that issue comes in the form of DLC. Breath of the Wild ended up getting what was called the Champion's Ballad, an amazing piece of DLC that added tons of more content to Breath of the Wild, while also adding great rewards like the Master Cycle. The issue with the DLC is the fact that what it provides is something that should have already been in the base game, that being more context and story for the rest of the cast, that being the champions. Not to mention, it also provides the Trial of the Sword, where you actually upgrade and make your Master Sword more of a formidable weapon, while also gaining the Master Cycle for better exploration. And the Master Cycle also comes accompanied with another boss fight and another dungeon, Link's own personal Divine Beasts. Even if the DLC is fantastic, if it feels like it should have been in the game to start with because it would have added a lot more than what the game already has, that kind of brings up a point of concern. Probably the best way to describe this issue would be as if Wind Waker got a DLC which added the Water Dungeon, which is something that they were going to add anyways, but they couldn't due to time constraints. It would kind of feel scummy, as if Nintendo is marketing and selling stuff that should have already been in the game to start with. And finally, the biggest major issue with Breath of the Wild is that major elements don't actually seem to matter anymore. Whether you like this or not, the Triforce no longer is a real important aspect, and it's only seen twice. The Master Sword, though a really cool upgrade for sure, and an awesome weapon to have that doesn't actually break but just needs to recharge, doesn't actually have that much of a story importance. I mean, there's a cool little bit with Fi appearing, but you don't actually need it to beat the game or to get the best ending. It's just kind of there as a cool Easter egg and just to give you that much more for your arsenal. Rather than all the other Zeldas where the Master Sword was always needed to slay the King of Evil, since it was literally the Sword of Evil's bane. This isn't a bad thing by any means, it just shows another way Breath of the Wild breaks the conventions of Zelda. Link himself as a character doesn't really provide that much as of character growth. Sure, Link has lost his memory, but the memory is more of paint a picture for Zelda. We never see any kind of character growth from Link as he learns and explores about the friends that have passed away, the woman that loved him dying. We see nothing from Link. And though Link isn't really a protagonist that really speaks all that much, you can clearly tell by Link's expressions the way he's growing up. Skyward Sword is probably one of the best examples of Link as a character having massive character growth, starting as just a boy from the Skylands to becoming the hero that ends demise. They were able to give Link so much character growth through the art of expression. And this is what makes Link such an awesome character, because he needs no words to express how he is and how he's growing up, and we see that continuously in every Zelda game. But in Breath of the Wild, Link feels more blank, more expressionless. He does have expressions, yes, but they're very few and far between, and you never really feel like you're spending any time with Link himself, and him growing as a character, and realizing all that's been lost, and the life that he no longer has. And then the final boss also doesn't actually seem to matter. If you get all the Divine Beasts, Calamity Ganon's nothing more than just a basic old cakewalk, as his entire health bar it gets immediately halved. And the later half of his form is just catching him in mid-flurry rush in order to deal damage to him in between invincibility frames. And this is the only real challenging part in this entire fight. After this, you have nothing more than what becomes an interactive cinematic cutscene where you just ride around on a horse shooting at a massive big old pig that does nothing but shoot lasers in oddball directions and doesn't actually pose a threat to you at all. Sure, this final bit is extremely epic and the actual music accompanying it is absolutely amazing, but there's nothing actually here. Where final bosses in Zelda have always been grand moments of final battles where Link finally overcomes the odds and truly becomes the hero, this one feels nothing more than just running around in circles shooting massive big old glowing spots. Now before we wrap up, I do want to look into one more thing. Master Mode. Master Mode was added through the DLC expansion packs for Breath of the Wild. With Master Mode being an intensive difficulty increase, it made it to where a lot of enemies were a lot more challenging. There were now golden enemy types that also scaled up with the player or were just out in the world, which provided a whole lot more challenge, and you really needed to beef up your arsenal and get prepped up before you could actually take them down, especially gold Lynels. Bosses and all enemy types had the ability to self-heal after a set amount of time, which meant you really need a lot of weapons that can lay down the hurt very quickly, otherwise you're going to be in a stalemate or inevitably get ran ragged as you lose weapon after weapon if you don't take them down quick enough. And this also applies to the final boss. In my original run of Breath of the Wild, the final boss, especially in the second phase, was, though more difficult, still relatively easy. But in Master Mode, this second phase was tough and an absolute war of attrition. Not only did he hit hard, but his health continuously kept increasing the longer I took to actually damage him. And if I ever go back to replay Breath of the Wild, I always replay it in Master Mode, as it adds a lot of challenge that I felt the original base game kind of started to lack, especially once you started to explore and get high-level weapons. And again, though this might be directly or indirectly, this did get fixed in Tears of the Kingdom, where enemies hit hard no matter what, and I was scrambling to try and upgrade my armor so I can actually stand a chance. But in Breath of the Wild, I didn't get that same sensation until I entered Master Mode. Now, I think it should be pretty obvious, after deep diving into what made Zelda games what they are today, to deep diving into Breath of the Wild itself, it's clear that this game broke a lot of the traditional Zelda conventions. They ended up breaking the traditional linear storytelling of Zelda in favor of this more open-ended one, where the mystery was immediately divulged at the very start. Breath of the Wild broke the traditional dungeon and puzzle design, where instead of having massive labyrinths where you use brand new skills learned in that labyrinth to your advantage, and having a final boss that tests those skills that you've learned, now dungeons are more open-ended and can be completed extremely quickly, with boss fights that can be defeated at any point in the game. Breath of the Wild also broke the original design of Zelda's exploration. Normally, exploration in Zelda games, though sometimes the worlds were vast or small, they were generally condensed to where there was always something to find and do, and you were always moving forward. But you would always come to a point where you were missing items or abilities to be able to fully explore an area, which would make you have to backtrack later to find that item. Now in Breath of the Wild, with how open this world is, you can find anything at any moment. Exploration exploration is more open than it ever has been. Sure, in Breath of the Wild, that exploration could still be improved upon, and the variety in the world design has many opportunities to grow, and Tears of the Kingdom is proof of this. It allowed the players to craft their own adventure, to go anywhere they want. Where the only true downside was the sheer size of the world, and the variety of what there is to do being more spread out than desirable. Then there's the sense of self-empowerment, which has also been broken from the standard. In other Zelda games, you started off as extremely weak and had to slowly build yourself up through dungeons and just general exploration to get that much stronger each and every time, to the point to where it all came together in one final climactic battle. However, Breath of the Wild, you immediately have the ability to take on any scenario and any battle. It's more of a matter of your own skill rather than what you actually have. However, with this being more open-ended, it did kind of shoot itself in the foot with the boss battles, since they didn't actually scale it with the player, meaning when you do explore, the major boss fights get sidelined hardcore, since you're always going to be positioned not only to deal some serious damage, but their challenge is kind of lost unless you're in Master Mode or you go directly to them. But even if Breath of the Wild does have flaws, this deep dive has given me a new appreciation for Breath of the Wild and all that it's done. I also ended up doing an entire replay of Breath of the Wild in Master Mode before Tears of the Kingdom come out, and then before even writing this script, I followed it up by playing all of Tears of the Kingdom and beating it. All this led me to a conclusion that I didn't expect to ever make. Breath of the Wild as a game is great. It does so many amazing things and improves on so many new aspects. It redefined what a Zelda was. But even if it did redefine the series, it shattered all the previous conventions of that very same franchise, and changed the very meaning of what it is to be a Zelda game, which will always make Breath of the Wild, at least to me, the game that broke Zelda. And you know what? I'm glad that it did.